587 is perhaps the crucial year in our study of the prophets of Israel. In that year, the Babylonians carried the leading citizens of Judah into exile in Babylon. They removed the king, they destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and they decimated the temple, leaving only rubble in its place. For those left to live among the ruins, and for those carried away into exile, there was a great crisis of faith. For nearly half a century, the people lived in this crisis, struggling to make sense of what had happened, struggling to understand where and how God might be at work. In 538, after the fall of the Babylonians, Cyrus of Persia freed the exiled Israelites and sent them home to rebuild their lives and to rebuild the temple. But in nearly 18 years, very little happened. Construction of the temple barely got past the planning stages. Having lived through a crisis of faith, the people were struggling to make sense of their lives, struggling to understand their identity, their calling, their purpose as God's chosen people. What, they wondered, does it mean to be Israel? Before exile, it had meant having a king, having a temple, having priests. But now all of that was gone. In 520, in the midst of a horrible drought, the prophet Haggai comes onto the scene. He prophesies for only 5 months, roughly from August to December. And the heart of his message is simple. In chapter 1, verse 8, the prophet proclaims, "Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house, that I may take pleasure in it, that I may appear in my glory, says the Lord." This is Haggai's prophetic word to the people of Israel, struggling to make sense of their life after exile. Rebuild the temple. Haggai never threatens. Haggai never accuses. Haggai argues his case before the people. He looks at the grim situation, the drought, the confusion, the despair, and he wonders, how have you fared? Consider how you have fared. Times were tough. There was no arguing about that. But for the people, tough times meant that there was no time to rebuild the temple. But for Haggai, the cause and effect were reversed. Because there was no time for rebuilding the temple, times were tough. Haggai turned the people's argument on its head. "You have looked for much, and lo, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why, says the Lord of hosts? Because of my house that lies in ruins, while you busy yourselves, each with his own house." I doubt many of us would put temple building at the top of our list of prophetic activities. Remember Jeremiah? Jeremiah had condemned the temple and called it a den of robbers. And Ezekiel had looked at the idolatrous worship taking place in the temple and called it an abomination. Rebuild the temple then. We wonder, wasn't the temple part of the problem? And yet, rebuild the temple is Haggai's call to action. There is no talk of justice. There is no mention of the poor, no mention of the widow, no mention of the orphan. It's only rebuild the temple. You see, Haggai understood that God, our God, is not everywhere. God is not always available at our beck and call. God is holy. God is righteous. God is elusive. God is mystery. Even Isaiah says, "Seek the Lord while he may be found." The God of Israel, our God, is a God who chooses to be concretely present, a God who chooses to get involved personally, leading a people from slavery into freedom out of Egypt, establishing a relationship of covenant promises, and giving the land as a place where God's people could live for Him. And in all of our failures and in all of our shortcomings, God keeps working. God keeps choosing to come and to move among us again. Why rebuild the temple? For Haggai, it's because God is ready to give again, ready to come, ready to be in relationship again. The Lord speaks to Haggai and says, I am about to shake the heavens and the earth. In other words, I'm about to move. I'm about to do something big. And that, Haggai proclaims, is the good news. God is at work. God is ready to come, ready to forgive, ready to be in relationship again. A new future, God's future, is just there on the horizon. A day of peace, a day of blessing in God's presence. At the end of the book, the Lord speaks to Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David, in line for the throne. And he says, I will take you and I will make you like a signet ring because I have chosen you. Years later, in a manger in Bethlehem, this God would choose to come and be with us again, born as one of us, tabernacling among us, as John says, born as a tiny baby, a baby who is also a king, a descendant of David, a descendant of Zerubbabel, who had heard Haggai's prophetic word years before. Why rebuild the temple? Because God chooses to get involved. God chooses to be present among us. God chooses to give. God chooses to love. So go up to the hills and bring the wood and build the house, that I may take pleasure in it, that I may appear in all my glory, says the Lord.